Hola, welcome to this League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County's review of statewide measures in the 2022 election. I am Ed Cabrera. Our Voter Services Committee of volunteers and I will discuss the history and explain the components of each proposition. We shall also be introducing the proponents and opponent of the props as well as their fiscal impact. Finally, we shall present the arguments for and against each proposition. Let us begin.
Welcome to the pros and cons of California's Proposition Number 1. I'm Lee Livick, and I'm going to fill you in on some information that'll help you make a more informed vote. California is one of 6 U.S. states that will have an abortion-related measure on the ballot, the most to occur in the U.S. in a single year. Other states with votes regarding abortion are Kansas, Kentucky, Michigan, Montana, and Vermont. Even though the 1969 Supreme Court ruled that the California Constitution provides a right to an abortion, California's Democratic legislature fears that changes in the legal interpretation of the state constitution or future conservative control of the state legislature, as well as a possible national abortion ban, could undermine those protections. The proposed constitutional amendment California was introduced by the legislature in early June and was passed with the overwhelming support of both chambers by the end of the month. In 2002, California's Reproductive Privacy Act specifically provides that every individual possesses A, the fundamental right to choose or refuse birth control, and B, the fundamental right to choose to bear a child or obtain an abortion. It does not permit abortion once a fetus is viable. What Proposition actually does is amends California's Constitution. It amends the Constitution to read, "The state shall not deny or interfere with an individual's reproductive freedom in their most intimate decisions, which includes their fundamental right to choose to have an abortion and their fundamental right to choose or refuse contraceptives." This section is intended to further the constitutional right to privacy guaranteed by Section 1 and the constitutional right to not be denied equal protection guaranteed by Section 7. Nothing herein narrows or limits the right to privacy or equal protection. Shown on the screen in front of you is a list of political supporters for Proposition 1. As well as groups that support Proposition 1. Opponents of Proposition 1 include primarily faith-based groups, although the Democrats for Life is a political advocacy nonprofit organization that seeks to elect anti-abortion Democrats and to encourage the Democratic Party to oppose euthanasia, capital punishment, and abortion. The California Legislative Analyst's Office projects no direct fiscal impact with the passage of the amendment. However, there may be additional costs if the amendment is challenged in court. Others say that there will be increased costs for providing birth control and/or abortion services to low-income members of the population. However, those services are already being provided, so that may not be an increased cost. It just depends on your point of view. Pros to Proposition 1 include changing the Constitution guarantees that the right to abortion or the birth of a child and/or birth control will remain a private and personal decision between the individual and their doctor, regardless of the future political climate in our state and in our nation. Reproductive rights are economic rights. Hindering reproductive rights prevents women from freely and fully participating in the economy. A woman loses work time when pregnant and caring for a child, and the costs of childcare are exorbitant. Language does define viability. The Reproductive Privacy Act defines viability as the point in a pregnancy when, in the good faith medical judgment of a physician, on the particular facts of the case before the physician, there is a reasonable likelihood of the fetus's sustained survival outside the uterus without the application of extraordinary medical measures. Some of the arguments against Proposition 1 include the fact that its language is overly vague and may result in late-term abortions or abortions after 24 weeks, even if the baby is healthy and the life of the mother is not threatened. Or that it's just a ploy to get liberal voters out to the polls. It could result in an influx of women from states that do not allow abortions, thereby straining our medical systems and creating a sanctuary state here in California. And that it's just not necessary. A no vote leaves the state constitution as it is, still guaranteeing reproductive rights and the right to privacy. However, it leaves open to change should political climate in the state change.
And on this year's ballot are not one, but two propositions dealing with the issue of increasing legalized gambling in the state. Let's begin with Proposition 26. The short history on Proposition 26. The Supreme Court, just recently in 2018, legalized sports betting, and a number of states have jumped aboard and legalized sports betting. Some tribes in California are hoping that we will join them. As a result, they spent quite a bit of money to make sure that this happens at their casinos on their reservation and for tracks, horse racing tracks in California. This comes to us as a bit of a last resort. Concerns wanting to bring online sports betting to California had failed in their attempt to convince Sacramento legislators to make it happen. So now they are bringing it to the people. Now, if this proposition passes, what will happen is that we will get sports wagering on tribal lands, but only by federal recognized Native American tribes. And we'll also get roulette and dice games, which they have wanted for quite a while. But once again, only subject to become law if the governor and the legislature approve separate compacts. This all begins later on this year, and the betting will begin in 4 counties where major racetracks like Del Mar in Southern California, for example, and only by people 21 years and older. Proponents tell us that tens of millions of dollars will come to the state of California as a result of this proposition. And the key is that 70% of those monies will still be in the general fund. Consequently, there's going to be some flexibility on the part of the governor and the legislature. The remainder, the 30% that remains, will be earmarked for programs aimed at problem gambling prevention and also mental health, and an additional 15% for the enforcement and control of gambling. One of the key components to this proposition is that the tribes will be able to enter the the lucrative area of roulette and craps, an area that they've wanted to enter for some time now, but they had been prevented from doing so. In addition, they will be able to sue their competition, card rooms, who they say at times illegally offer blackjack. A protection in California is that none of the teams, none of the universities in California can be the subject of bets unless they are involved in tournaments like the basketball tournament referred to as March Madness, and high school sports and events is territory that cannot be pursued. No betting on high school sports and events. The proposition proposes an across-the-board 10% tax on all wagers at the racing tracks. And as mentioned previously, the money will be earmarked for problem gambling programs. Wagering will be limited to those over the age of 21. And as also mentioned, the tribes can now privately sue those concerns that violate the law. Amongst the supporters for Proposition 26 are the California Nations Indian Gaming Association, which is made up of 39 of the 109 California Indian tribes, both the Chamber of Commerce of the American Indians and the African Americans in California, and also prominent state official, State Treasurer Fiona Ma. Those in opposition to the proposition include the major casinos, which see an invasion of their areas, primarily roulette and craps. Proponents say there will be a windfall to the state of California. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars that will come your way as a result of the tax on the wagering. On the downside is that you're going to have a new layer of bureaucracy that is going to be given the responsibility of enforcing this new law, collecting the taxes, and prosecuting those who violate the law. So here the argument for both sides. First of all, the money generated from the taxes would benefit primarily schools and wildfire prevention. Also, monies would be spent on gambling disorders and the treatment of other mental health disorders. And it would give tribes who historically have not have owned or controlled casinos a new source of revenue. And much of that revenue, as stated before, would go to health and mental health programs. Here's the cut of the non-gaming tribes. And this might seem like a strange argument, but many professionals see temporary housing as a short-term solution for a long-term problem, and there would not be an overabundance of money being spent on that solution. On the con side, the argument is that some legal card rooms would have to shut down, and consequently, good-paying jobs would be lost. An interesting argument, gambling addiction would increase as a result of legalized sports betting. And even if you add roulette and craps as examples, it's not going to really create a great number of jobs. And because of that extra layer of bureaucracy, it'll actually lose money in the form of enforcement costs. And by the way, aren't tribal lands separate nations? Can they be taxed in the first place? Opponents see legal problems in the future. And the opponents also see that mental health funds, dearly needed and in short supply, would actually go to a new need for gambling addiction programs. And also, a final argument is that the earmarks are only limited, whereas in Proposition 27, they're almost unlimited. Now we'll be reviewing Proposition 27, which some people find similar, but there are differences. And we'll make it clear what the differences are at the end of our review of this proposition, Proposition 27. Back in last century, California voters gave tribes exclusivity when it came to operating casinos in California. Now those tribes feel threatened by Proposition 27 as it seeks to make inroads into their monopoly, so say the tribes. Furthermore, they say this is just another example of a broken promise to Indians, says a spokesperson for the tribes. So there's a group of large sports books, people like FanDuel and DraftKings, that are bankrolling this initiative, which would allow Californians to place bets online. It's not easy to get into this game. The ante is prohibitive. First of all, you'd have to come up with a $100 million fee. And you should already be in business in at least 10 states. Or you have an alternative, you could be licensed in 5 states and running 12 casinos. Not a marketplace for mom and pop. It might come as a surprise to you to know that many of the gambling firms are losing money. Not because it's not a lucrative market, but because there's so many competitors. And frankly, they have reached a point where they have covered the entire market. So they require a new market, and that's what online sports betting promises to be. So that finally, the gambling firms can once again start making a profit. You may want to know that a majority of the states have already legalized online betting. The sports leagues are on board because you may be, as a home fan, be interested in rooting for your local team, but this would spur interest in teams outside your market. So California fans could be more interested in New York teams, for example. The NFL is aboard. They have contracted with 7 of the firms, coincidentally, the firms that are behind this proposition. Major League Baseball historically has been against betting, but in this case, they approve of, in their language, the strong integrity provisions that are written into this proposition. Few people will debate that homelessness is not a major challenge to the state of California. It has reached crisis proportion. Ahead of this battle are the big city mayors, and they're asking for something permanent in the way of funding this battle. Governor Newsom in the state of California is spending close to $8 billion on this challenge this year alone. And as an aside, if you want opportunities to gamble, there may be a few in the state of California. Try 66 casinos, 84 card rooms, 29 fairs, and look around. 23,000 stores where you can buy your lottery ticket. Let's look at the components of this proposition. It would legalize gambling online for those over 21 years of age. But in order to conduct this business, you have to be a recognized tribe, and you have to be eligible businesses those people reaching that ante. And those people placing bets must be in California and not located on Indian lands, because remember, all this is online. And there's a 10% tax on all this sports revenue. So how would this revenue pie be divided? First, off the top, you'd have to pay the bureaucracy for the regulation of this process. Once done, the remaining pie, or 85% of it, would be given to homelessness programs. That lasting revenue stream that mayors were asking for. A remainder, 15%, would be divided amongst the tribes which historically have not been involved in gambling. And finally, language in the proposition would specify standards for this entire process. I've grouped the supporters into three groups. Foremost, the large gambling concerns, the big names in online sports gambling. Next, the mayors of some of the large cities of California. And finally, those nonprofit concerns which would carry out programs aimed at diminishing homelessness. If you're familiar with California tribes, then you'll be familiar with these names. These are some of the major tribes in California that involve themselves in gambling, but it's 58 plus tribes in California that are opposing Proposition 27. And as an aside, they're spending more money to oppose 27 than they are in supporting 26. Now, proponents tell us that the state of California will be making hundreds of millions of dollars annually from the tax revenues, the licensing fees, and any penalties. Now, they caution that there are going to be regulatory costs. You have to control this process, but it's going to be offset by those millions of dollars collected by the state in taxes. The arguments for and against Proposition 27. First of all, there are plenty of safeguards that would keep young people from betting. It would also include hefty penalties for those people violating the law and would forbid any betting on high school sports. It would also provide that annual stream of funding to fight homelessness, but also mental health and addiction problems. It would also provide 15% of all tax revenue to go to those tribes which historically have not been involved in gambling. The opponents counter that now you're talking about every digital device in California becoming a gambling device. And did you know that gamblers, sports gamblers, are 5 times more likely to develop a problem with gambling? And if you're talking about devices are especially attractive to the young when it comes to beginning a life of gambling. What would you do to protect and keep people underage from gambling, say the opponents? And people would spend money they don't have, running up huge debts to gamble online. And there is very little opportunity for small entrepreneurs to enter this market. There have been some confusion amongst voters when talking about Propositions 26 and 27. They are similar. So we have provided you with a comparison chart to give you a quick look at the differences. First of all, in 26, most of the tribes are backing 26. There are tribes against it, but the far majority are in support of 26. There's going to be no online betting, but you will be able to bet on games at the casinos. There will be monies that will be going to anti-gambling programs as a result of Proposition 26. As you would guess, sports books are against Proposition 26, and so is the Republican Party. The key difference, perhaps, is that 70% of the revenues coming from Proposition 26 are going to go to the general fund, which means there's more flexibility on the part of legislators to be able to make changes and to be able to address problems like wildfires and floods in California. In the case of 27, most of the tribes are in opposition to 27. And primarily they're in opposition because we're talking about online sports betting, where people can bet from home, keeping them away from casinos. The earmarks for 27 are different. Earmarks meaning money promised. Tribes that historically have not been involved in casino revenues will now get a piece of the pie. Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party oppose Proposition 27. Critics point to 27 and say it is difficult for the average concern to become involved. It's only for the large corporations. And while there will be 85% of the tax revenues going to the homelessness programs, that is a promise, which means that monies cannot go to other areas, i.e. education, which is why the California Teachers Association opposes Proposition 27. There is further confusion in that what would happen if Proposition 26 and 27 both pass? Aren't they conflicting? Well, the California Constitution has something to say about this. Bottom line, if both pass, the one with the highest percentage of vote will take effect and the other will not. It's interesting to note that backers of Proposition 27 in their campaign literature state that 27 is not in conflict with 26. But you and I both know, since we've lived in California for some time, that it very likely might end up as a challenge in court if both propositions pass. Of course, it would make life simple if one proposition passes and the other one does not, or if both propositions fail.
Hello, I'm Lorraine Cabrera, and I'm here today to talk to you about Proposition 28. Since 2008, during the budget cuts, arts funding has declined in many school districts, and an emphasis was placed on reading and math. Only 1 in 5 public schools still has a full-time teacher for traditional arts programs, according to the initiative backers. Prop 98 passed in 1988. The California Constitution requires 40% of the state budget to be spent on K-14 education. This guarantee is a minimum and is calculated annually. Currently, there's no guaranteed source of annual funding in the state budget for arts and music education in K-12 public schools. State law requires schools to provide arts and music instruction to all students in grades 1 through 6. Additional funding for arts and music education in all K-12 public schools, including charter schools, will be annually allocated from the State General Fund on an amount equal to 1% of required state and local funding for public schools. A greater portion of the funds to schools serving more economic disadvantaged students will be allocated. And schools with 500 or more students must spend at least 80% of funding to employ teachers, with the remainder on training, supplies, and educational partnerships. This proposition requires audits and will limit administrative costs to 1% of funding. Beginning next year, the measure would increase spending up to $1.5 billion annually for the arts and education in our schools. Supporters for this proposition include Californians for Arts and Music Education in Public Schools, Austin Buter, former superintendent of Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest school district in our country, Arne Duncan, a former U.S. Secretary of Education. At this time, no organized opposition has been noted. Increased spending will likely be in the range of $800 million to $1 billion annually, beginning next year for the arts education in all our schools. Money will come from the general fund. Your taxes will not be raised. Arguments for: this initiative is timely as our country seeks to create a more just and equitable future for all our children. Currently, only 1 in 5 schools have a dedicated arts or music instructor. A boost of funding in arts and music education will help ensure the future workforce in media technology and will properly reflect the diversity of the children in our public schools. Proposition does not raise taxes. Arguments against: when revenue becomes tight in the future, the governor and legislature need a much more flexibility in the budget as possible to make sure that critical needs are funded. What happens if the student population decreases in future years while the number of disabled elderly people increase?
Hi, I'm Kim Murray, and I'm here today to talk to you about Proposition 29. Dialysis is an ongoing intensive medical treatment for kidney failure. Approximately 80,000 patients in California receive dialysis treatments. 2 for-profit companies operate 3/4 of California's 650 chronic dialysis clinics. Proposition 29 is the third attempt by the union representing healthcare workers to increase clinic regulations. In 2018, Proposition 8 attempted to limit clinic profits by requiring clinics refund anything beyond 115% of the actual cost of dialysis treatment directly to patients or insurers, rejected by 60% of the voters. In 2020, Proposition 23 was an attempt to require that a physician be present during treatment. That also was rejected by 60% of voters. Opponents, clinic owners, spent over $250,000 to defeat these measures. Proposition 29 would require a licensed medical professional to be present during the times that patients are receiving treatment. This time, a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a physician assistant can be present. And if there are no staff available locally, it would authorize an option for qualified medical staff to be present via telehealth. Prop 29 would also require clinics to disclose the names of physicians with clinic ownership interests of 5% or more. Proposition 29 would place additional requirements on clinics and increase state oversight by requiring clinics to report infection data to the state, by prohibiting clinics from closing or substantially reducing services without state approval, and by prohibiting clinics from refusing to treat patients based on their source of payment. Supporters of Prop 29 include APAC, Californians for Kidney Dialysis Patient Protection, which is primarily sponsored by SEIU, United Healthcare Workers West. No other private groups or public organizations or individuals have come forward in support of this proposition. Proposition 29 is opposed by the for-profit companies operating dialysis clinics in California. These include DaVita and Fresenius. It's also opposed by business interests including the California Chamber of Commerce, California Medical Association, and the Republican Party of California. If approved by the voters, Prop 29 will increase the cost of providing dialysis treatment. Clinics would face increased annual costs of several $100,000 for staff salaries. Clinics could choose to absorb these costs and reduce their profits, which would not increase costs to patients or insurance providers. Clinics could reduce services by reducing hours or closing clinics, which could lead patients to be treated in emergency rooms or hospitals, increasing costs even further. Clinics could also negotiate rate increases with insurers. State and local governments who provide Medi-Cal, employee and retiree health coverage would likely face increased costs in the neighborhood of tens of millions of dollars annually. The CDPH will be faced with increased costs in the low millions of dollars annually to cover their new regulatory responsibilities. Clinic licensing fees would be increased to cover these costs. And now on to the pros and cons. Proponents of Prop 29 claim that having a licensed medical professional present during dialysis, which is an inherently dangerous procedure, will increase patient safety. Proponents of Prop 29 claim that increasing oversight and transparency will improve care and increase safety, and cite a need for more frequent inspection and reporting of infections to the state. It will also require disclosure of the financial interests of medical providers. Supporters imply that clinics discriminate against patients based on their source of payment and that Prop 29 will address this. Proponents claim that dialysis clinics can well afford to invest more of their profits to increase the quality of care they provide to patients. Opponents claim that this level of staffing is unnecessary and that there is no data to support the need for a medical practitioner to be present during treatment. Each patient already has a kidney specialist who monitors their care, and the staff providing treatment are specially trained. Neither states nor the CDPH department nor Medicare require this level of staffing. Opponents raise the worry that medical staff will be pulled from hospitals and other care facilities, leading to staffing shortages. Opponents argue that patients requiring dialysis are already covered by either Medi-Cal or Medicare, and opponents insist that the increased costs will lead to reduced services and access to care.
Hi, I'm Linda Sherrar, and I will be discussing Proposition 30. California spends billions annually on wildfire management and the development of zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure to support that, but some businesses and agencies think that more needs to be done to stop climate crisis. For instance, providing more zero-emission vehicle infrastructure would mean like adding electric fueling stations to be more accessible for people who own those vehicles. This proposal is called the millionaire's tax because it proposes to tax people whose income is $2 million or more per year. It's gotten most of its funding from Lyft, which is required under state law to increase its share of electric cars by 2030. And Lyft would like to see more support for them to provide that increase in electric cars. Proposition 30 increases the tax on personal income that is over $2 million by 1.75% for individuals or married couples. This means that people making more than $2 million would see their excess income taxed by 1.75% more. So how much money would this proposition generate? It would generate an estimated 3 to 5 billion, but possibly much more than that annually. And we don't know how much money it would actually make, but it could be past 5 billion annually. What we do know is that the funding would be split up between three different things. 45% would go to supporting electric vehicles, which they call incentives. 35% would be for building more infrastructure, like fueling stations. 20% would be for wildfire prevention. Proposition 30 is supported by Lyft, the rideshare company, by the California State Association of Electrical Workers, who would get more work and more jobs for their workers in creation of zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure, and by the California environmental voters because of the efforts for climate control and taking care of wildfires. Opponents to Proposition 30 are surprisingly Governor Newsom and the California Teachers Association, who both oppose the proposition because it is earmarked for only 3 specific things. Instead, so it doesn't allow them flexibility in where to use the money, should it be needed elsewhere. The Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association is opposed to the proposition because they're opposed to any proposition to raise taxes. Proposition 30 would give the state of California about $5 billion in revenue almost every year, and that would increase over time. So this would amount to about $4 billion every year in zero-emission vehicle funding and about $1 billion every year for wildfire management. This measure could help decrease state and local costs for wildfire prevention and management, but the size of the amount of money that it would make is difficult to predict. On the pro side, for support for this proposition, only 0.2% of people in California will be taxed on this proposition. It could raise up to $5 billion every year. It will provide rebates for zero-emission vehicles, which means that anybody who buys a car with zero emission will get some money back. It will expand the charging network or the number of places that you can fuel your electric vehicle. $1 billion every year will go to reduce the impact and management of wildfires. People who are concerned about climate change support this initiative 2-1. Against this proposition are the people and agencies that say that California already has the highest income tax. For example, Texas, Florida, and Nevada have no income tax at all. The richest Californians will flee the state and take their money elsewhere. It is the product of special interest, namely Lyft. And they also say that the amount of money raised will be inconsistent. Education also does not benefit from the higher money tax revenue received.
Hi, I'm Linda Rinaldi, and I'm going to be talking about Proposition 31. This petition is a referendum. In 2020, the California State Legislature passed a law banning the sale of most flavored tobacco products. This has not been enacted yet because of the referendum, which requires approval by the voters. Manufacturers and retailers say that this will hurt their business and drop revenues. California lawmakers and healthcare providers say that flavored tobacco targets young people and people of color. A yes vote on this measure means that in-person stores and vending machines could not sell most flavored tobacco products and tobacco flavor enhancers. A yes vote supports enactment of the Senate Bill 793. If the voters decide to uphold the law, California would join a growing number of states and cities that have moved to ban flavored tobacco products. Supporters of a yes vote on this referendum proposition include Michael Bloomberg, who was a mayor of New York and a philanthropist, and Kaiser Permanente healthcare system. Opponents, those wanting a no vote, include tobacco companies, R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris USA, and the National Association of Tobacco Outlets. Last year, the state tobacco taxes raised about $2 billion. These are largely used for healthcare programs in the state. Overall, the impact of Senate Bill 793 could decrease state tobacco tax revenues. Estimates are uncertain, but range in the millions. On the other hand, reduced tobacco use may decrease the need for treatment for tobacco-related illnesses, but the effect on health and longevity is still unknown. Arguments for the ban are that 80% of kids who have used tobacco start with a flavored product. The ban will help reduce smoking rates and therefore help save lives. The ban will also prevent smoke-related healthcare expenses and prevents tobacco companies from causing more harm to Black communities. On the other side, the arguments on the other side say that this is an adult prohibition. It's already illegal to sell products to anybody under 21. It will cost the taxpayers billions of dollars. Criminal gangs will benefit by the black market, and there will be more neighborhood crime.
Thank you for joining us in our review of the propositions on this year's state ballot. Thank you further in committing to becoming engaged and educated voters. Join us at the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County as permanent members. You can have all your questions answered by sending an email to info@lwvslo.org. You can learn more about us via our world-class website that can be found by Googling LWVSLOCO. Help us in our mission to educated voters. See you in the future. Hasta luego.